3 days after my boyfriend proposed, I came up with a plan to make him pay for what he did. My boyfriend proposed with this gorgeous vintage ring with sapphires and diamonds in an intricate setting. Once I was done crying and freaking out and saying yes 100 times, I asked where he got it and he told me it was his grandmother's ring that had been passed down through his family for generations. I was so touched that he wanted me to have something with that much history and meaning. I posted photos on Instagram that night with close-ups of the ring and captions about how lucky I was to be marrying into such a wonderful family. My friends flooded the comments with congratulations. Then on Monday morning, a woman I didn't know sent me a direct message. That ring belonged to my grandmother. I need to know where your fiancé really got it. I looked at her profile and realized she was my fiancé's ex-girlfriend from 5 years ago. I felt annoyed because I assumed she was just jealous and trying to start drama. I messaged her back saying the ring had been in his family for generations and she must be mistaken. She responded with 3 old family photos showing the exact same ring on an elderly woman's hand. That's my grandmother. The ring disappeared from my apartment 5 years ago, right after we broke up. She included a police report from 5 years ago listing stolen jewelry with a detailed description that matched my ring perfectly, including the engraving inside the band that said EMH 1952 for her great-grandmother's initials. I agreed to meet her at a diner because I needed to understand what was happening. We sat across from each other comparing the photos, and I felt sick as I realized the ring on my finger was definitely the one from her family pictures. She told me the ring had disappeared along with several other pieces of jewelry after a bad breakup when my fiancé had come to collect his things from her apartment. She'd suspected him but had no proof. We started talking more and she mentioned other items that had gone missing, describing them in detail. My stomach dropped because I recognized some of the descriptions. When I got home, I went through my jewelry box carefully. 3 pieces that I thought were real diamonds and gold were obviously cheap fakes when I looked closely. He'd been stealing from me too, probably replacing my real jewelry with costume pieces bit by bit. I called the ex back and we spent the next 2 hours on the phone piecing together his pattern. We realized he'd probably done this to other women before us. I wanted to go to the police immediately, but she told me they wouldn't do anything without concrete evidence. And even with the police report from 5 years ago, he'd probably just claim he found the ring or bought it somewhere. I sat there furious, thinking about how he'd proposed with stolen property, and had been systematically robbing me for months. Then I had an idea. I told the ex I knew how we could catch him and get everything back. We would set a trap. We came up with a plan over the next 2 days. I would tell my fiancé that my wealthy aunt was coming to visit and needed somewhere safe to store an expensive diamond necklace for a few days. We set up hidden cameras in my apartment. I staged a phone call with my aunt, right in front of him, talking loudly about how the necklace was worth over $50,000 and how nervous I was about keeping it at my place. I left a fancy jewelry box on my dresser in plain sight. The next day, I told him I was going out with friends and would be gone all afternoon. The ex and I sat in her car watching the camera feed on my phone. Within an hour of me leaving, he was in my bedroom opening the jewelry box. We had him on camera, but we weren't going to call the police. While he was distracted at my apartment, the ex drove to his storage unit across town. She'd kept a key from when they dated and he'd never changed the lock. Inside the unit, we found plastic bags full of jewelry. Way more than either of us expected. Necklaces, rings, bracelets, watches. There had to be pieces from dozens of women. We loaded everything into her car and drove back to her apartment. We spread it all out on her living room floor and started documenting everything with photos so we could try to return the items to their rightful owners. I was going through a bag of necklaces when the ex reached the bottom of one of the duffel bags. She pulled something out and went completely still. I looked over and saw her holding a driver's license and a cell phone. She turned the license toward me and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The name and face on the license belonged to a woman who'd been all over the news 6 months ago. A woman who'd disappeared without a trace. The ex and I stared at the phone and the license sitting in her shaking hands. This wasn't about stolen jewelry anymore. I couldn't move. Camilla and I just sat there on her living room floor with all this stolen jewelry spread out around us, staring at the driver's license and phone in her hands. My whole body started shaking. I had to put down the necklace I was holding because my fingers wouldn't stop trembling. Camilla's face had turned completely white. Neither of us said anything for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or 2. My brain kept trying to make sense of what we were looking at. That was Magdalena Wynn's face on the license. The woman from the news. The one who disappeared 6 months ago. And we found her stuff in my fiancé's storage unit. I finally managed to speak and asked Camilla if we should call the police right now. My voice came out shaky and weird. Camilla set the license down carefully like it might break and said we needed to think this through. She reminded me that we technically broke into the storage unit. We didn't have permission to be there. She still had a key from 5 years ago, but that didn't make it legal. I argued that we had to call anyway because this was about a missing person. We spent the next 20 minutes sitting there debating what to do. The license just sat between us on the floor. Every time I looked at it, I felt sick. Camilla worried that if we admitted to breaking in, the evidence might not count in court. I said I didn't care about getting in trouble if it meant finding out what happened to this woman. We went back and forth until Camilla finally suggested calling the tip line anonymously. I shook my head and pointed at all the evidence surrounding us. We had physical proof. We had her actual license and phone. An anonymous tip wouldn't help anyone. Camilla looked at the license again and then at me. She nodded slowly. We agreed that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting ourselves from legal trouble. I picked up my phone. My fingers were still shaking so badly I almost dropped it twice. I pulled up the non-emergency police number and pressed call. The operator answered and I asked to speak with whoever was handling the Magdalena Wynn missing person case. She put me on hold. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears while I waited. The hold music was some generic soft jazz that felt totally wrong for the situation. Camilla sat next to me biting her thumbnail and staring at the phone and license on the floor. Then someone picked up. A man's voice said his name was Detective Octavius Wynn. My stomach dropped when I heard the last name. He had to be related to her. I told him I had information about Magdalena's disappearance. He asked what kind of information and his voice got tight and controlled. I said I found her driver's license and phone. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then he asked me to come to the station immediately. He gave me the address and said to ask for him at the front desk. I said okay, and hung up. Camilla was already standing up and looking for plastic bags. We carefully packed Magdalena's license and phone into a Ziploc bag without touching them more than we already had. Then we started loading all the stolen jewelry back into the bags and duffel bags we'd brought it in. It took us almost 15 minutes to get everything back in Camilla's car. We didn't talk the whole time. I think we were both trying to process that this situation just became way more serious than recovering stolen property. The drive to the police station felt surreal. Camilla drove and I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window. Neither of us turned on the radio. I kept thinking about my fiancé and wondering what he'd done. The jewelry was one thing. But Magdalena disappeared. And now we found her stuff in his storage unit. Detective Wynn met us in the lobby when we arrived. I recognized him immediately even though I'd never seen him before. He had the same eyes as Magdalena from her pictures on the news. The same shape to his face. He looked professional in his suit and detective badge, but I noticed his hands clench into fists when I said we found his sister's belongings in my fiancé's storage unit. He led us down a hallway to an interview room. It was small with a metal table and a few chairs. Everything looked gray and institutional. We sat down and Detective Wynn pulled out a notebook. I started explaining everything from the very beginning. I told him about the proposal and the ring, about the Instagram message from Camilla, about discovering the ring was stolen from her grandmother, about setting the trap with the fake necklace, about going to the storage unit and finding all the jewelry. Detective Wynn listened without interrupting me once. He just kept taking notes while his jaw got tighter and tighter with each new piece of information I gave him. When I got to the part about finding the storage unit full of jewelry from dozens of women, he asked how we accessed the unit. Camilla spoke up and admitted she still had a key from when she dated my fiancé 5 years ago. Detective Wynn wrote that down and said it complicated things legally. But then he looked up from his notebook and said he was more concerned with finding out what happened to his sister than with how we got into the storage unit. Camilla reached into her bag and pulled out the plastic bag with Magdalena's license and phone. She slid it across the table to Detective Wynn. I watched his face as he picked it up and looked at his sister's driver's license through the plastic. His professional mask cracked just a little bit. His eyes got wet and his hand shook slightly as he held the bag. He stared at it for a long moment without saying anything. Then he excused himself and stood up quickly. Through the window in the door, I could see him in the hallway taking deep breaths. His shoulders were shaking. He stood there for maybe 2 minutes trying to pull himself back together before coming back into the room. In his eyes, I could see he was barely holding it together. But he sat back down and opened his notebook again like we were just discussing a routine case. He asked me specific questions about when I last saw the ring, whether my fiancé ever mentioned knowing anyone named Magdalena, if he'd taken any unusual trips in the past 6 months. I answered everything as clearly as I could while Camilla sat beside me adding details about the storage unit and how long her key had worked in the lock. Detective Wynn wrote down every single word we said, and when we finished he told us he needed to move fast before my fiancé realized anything was wrong. He explained that the video footage of my fiancé attempting to steal the fake necklace gave them grounds to arrest him for theft, and once they had him in custody, they could question him about everything else. Detective Wynn assigned 2 officers to escort me back to my apartment so I could pack a bag and get my important belongings before my fiancé came home from work. He told me not to take anything that might be evidence, especially not the engagement ring. The officers drove me to my apartment and waited in the living room while I went to my bedroom. I stood there looking at everything with shaking hands, seeing all the normal, everyday things that suddenly felt wrong and dirty. The coffee mug my fiancé used that morning still sat in the sink with a little bit of coffee dried at the bottom, and I felt sick thinking about how calm he'd been drinking his coffee after potentially killing someone. His jacket hung on the back of a chair. His shoes were by the door. Everything looked so ordinary and harmless. I grabbed my laptop off the desk and unplugged the charger. I pulled my important papers from the file drawer, my birth certificate and passport and insurance documents. I threw clothes into a duffel bag without really paying attention to what I was grabbing, just pulling things from hangers and drawers. I packed my phone charger and my toothbrush and the medications I take every day. The engagement ring sat on my dresser where I'd left it that morning, the sapphires catching the light. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering how happy I'd been when he proposed, how I'd cried and said yes over and over. Now I knew it was stolen from Camilla's grandmother, and he'd probably stolen from dozens of other women too. I decided to leave it right there on the dresser as evidence of his theft from her family. Let the police take it. I never wanted to see it again. The officers drove me back to Camilla's apartment, and I hauled my duffel bag up to her door. She'd already made up her couch with blankets and a pillow for me. We sat down and turned on the local news, but there was nothing yet about an arrest, which meant the police were still getting everything ready. Camilla ordered pizza from the place down the street, but when it arrived, neither of us could eat more than a few bites. We just sat there picking at the slices while staring at our phones and waiting for Detective Wynn to call with an update. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Around 6 that evening, my phone rang and I saw my fiancé's name on the screen. My heart started pounding and Camilla grabbed my arm. I forced myself to answer and tried to make my voice sound normal. He asked if I wanted to meet him for dinner at that Italian place we liked. I told him I wasn't feeling well and was planning to go to bed early. He sounded completely normal and unconcerned, asking if I needed him to pick up anything from the pharmacy on his way home. I said no and told him I just needed to sleep. He said he loved me, and I forced myself to say it back, even though the words made me want to throw up. When I hung up, Camilla and I just looked at each other. He had no idea his entire world was about to explode. An hour later, Detective Wynn called. They'd arrested my fiancé at his workplace on charges of attempted theft. He was being held for questioning right now. Detective Wynn said my fiancé immediately asked for a lawyer and refused to answer any questions, which was exactly what they'd expected him to do. But the arrest gave them what they needed to move forward with searching the storage unit legally. That evening, the police executed a search warrant on the storage unit using the attempted theft charge as grounds. Detective Wynn called again around 9 to confirm they'd recovered all the jewelry plus additional evidence they were still processing. His voice sounded exhausted, but there was something grimly satisfied in his tone, like he was finally making progress after months of hitting dead ends trying to find his sister. Camilla and I spent that night on her couch with the TV on, showing some mindless reality show neither of us was actually watching. Every little sound from the hallway or the street made us both jump. We kept checking our phones constantly, even though Detective Wynn said he wouldn't have more updates until morning. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times my fiancé had touched me, held my hand, kissed me. I kept wondering if those same hands had hurt Magdalena. Had he seemed different after she disappeared? Had I missed signs? I went over every memory from the past 6 months, trying to figure out if I'd been blind to something obvious. The next morning, Detective Wynn called right as Camilla was making coffee. He said the forensic team had analyzed Magdalena's phone overnight. The last activity on it was a text message exchange with someone using a burner phone number. The messages showed she was planning to meet someone she knew. The location data from her phone showed it went dead near a rural area outside the city. I remembered something then that made my stomach drop. My fiancé had mentioned having family property in a rural area where he used to go hunting. He'd shown me pictures once of the land, talking about how peaceful it was out there. When I told Detective Wynn this information, his voice got very quiet. He asked me for the exact location. I pulled up my Instagram and scrolled back through old photos until I found the ones where my fiancé had tagged the general area last year. I read Detective Wynn the location tag and heard him relaying the information to someone else in the background. Within hours, the police had identified the exact property and were organizing a search team. Detective Wynn called me back to explain they were bringing in cadaver dogs and forensic specialists. He told me this part might take days or even weeks, depending on how large the property was and what they found. His voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath it. He was preparing himself for what they might discover. I needed to prepare myself too. The next morning, a man named Ezekiel Houston called my phone and introduced himself as the prosecutor assigned to the case. He had a deep voice that sounded tired even though it was only 9 in the morning. He told me they were building a solid case against my fiancé for the theft charges, while the investigation into Magdalena's disappearance continued in parallel. The theft evidence was strong enough to guarantee conviction, but connecting my fiancé to what happened to Magdalena required more than just finding her belongings in his storage unit. They needed physical evidence, witness testimony, something concrete that proved he was involved in her disappearance. I asked what that meant for the timeline, and he said the theft trial could happen within 6 months, but the other investigation might take much longer. After we hung up, I felt frustrated because I wanted answers immediately, but the legal system moved slowly. Camilla made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table staring at all the jewelry we'd brought back from the storage unit. We needed to do something productive while we waited for news from the search team. I suggested we go through everything again, but this time focus on trying to identify the owners so we could return the stolen items. Camilla opened her laptop and created a spreadsheet with columns for item description, photo, estimated value, and any identifying marks. We spent the next 4 hours photographing every single piece and writing detailed descriptions. A gold bracelet with tiny sapphires, a diamond tennis necklace with a broken clasp, a men's watch with initials engraved on the back. Each piece represented someone who'd been stolen from and manipulated. By late afternoon, we had documented over 200 items, and my eyes hurt from staring at jewelry under Camilla's desk lamp. I decided to post carefully worded messages in local community groups on social media, asking if anyone had experienced jewelry theft in the past few years. I didn't mention my fiancé by name or give too many details about the ongoing investigation. Within an hour, my inbox started filling with responses. Women describing missing engagement rings, inherited necklaces, expensive watches that vanished from their apartments. I matched descriptions to items in our spreadsheet and felt sick as the scale of his operation became clear. He'd been doing this for years to dozens of women across the entire city. One message stood out from a woman who said she dated my fiancé 3 years ago. She described missing jewelry but also wrote about how his behavior changed near the end of their relationship. He became controlling and jealous, checking her phone and getting angry when she spent time with friends. Her description of how he escalated from charming to possessive made my stomach turn because I recognized some of those patterns in my own relationship. I'd written off certain behaviors as him being protective or caring deeply about me. I forwarded all the victim responses to Detective Wynn, along with our spreadsheet matching items to owners. He called back within 20 minutes and said he was assigning officers to interview each woman and document their stolen property. The investigation was expanding beyond what anyone expected. They discovered my fiancé had been systematically targeting women through dating apps for at least 7 years, creating profiles that made him seem successful and trustworthy. 2 days later, Natalia Peacock called while I was helping Camilla make dinner. She told me the forensic team found my fiancé's fingerprints on Magdalena's phone in multiple places, including the screen and the back casing. He'd touched that phone enough times to leave clear prints which he couldn't explain away, since he'd told police he never met Magdalena. This physical evidence connecting him directly to the missing woman strengthened the case significantly. I thanked her and hung up feeling a mix of relief that they had solid evidence and horror at what it meant. The next morning, Detective Wynn called with his voice sounding hollow and strained. The search team at the rural property found disturbed earth in a wooded area near the main house. They were bringing in excavation equipment and ground-penetrating radar. He told me to prepare myself because they might find something in the next few days. I could hear in his tone that he was preparing himself for the worst possible outcome. His sister had been missing for 6 months, and now they were digging up ground on property connected to the man who stole from his girlfriend. I spent those 2 days barely sleeping, checking my phone constantly, even though Detective Wynn said he'd call as soon as they had news. Camilla and I tried to watch movies, but neither of us could focus. On the third day, Detective Wynn called at 6 in the morning. They found human remains buried in the wooded area. The medical examiner needed dental records to confirm identity, but the location and circumstances pointed to Magdalena. His voice cracked slightly when he said her name. I thanked him for calling and sat on Camilla's couch staring at the wall. The reality crashed over me that I'd been engaged to someone capable of murder. I started crying even though I barely knew Magdalena, overwhelmed by the thought that she was a real person with a family who loved her, and my fiancé took her life. Camilla sat next to me and put her arm around my shoulders. She was crying too. We held each other and cried because we both realized how close we came to potentially being his victims. If Camilla hadn't sent that Instagram message, if I hadn't agreed to meet her, if we hadn't set that trap, would I have ended up like Magdalena? The news broke nationally that evening with headlines about a serial thief arrested in connection with a missing woman's murder. My phone started exploding with calls and texts from friends and family who saw the news and recognized my fiancé's name. Messages asking if I was okay, if the reports were true, if I needed anything. I turned off my phone because I couldn't handle explaining this to anyone yet. I couldn't find words to describe what it felt like to know I almost married a murderer. 2 days later, Detective Wynn called and asked if Camilla and I would be willing to meet with Magdalena's sister. His voice sounded careful when he explained that Felicia wanted to thank us in person for finding the evidence that led them to her sister. I felt my stomach twist because the idea of facing Magdalena's family scared me more than anything else in this whole situation. I told him yes anyway because it seemed like the right thing to do, even though I wanted to say no. Camilla agreed too when I called her after hanging up with the detective. We met Felicia 3 days later at a small coffee shop near the police station. I spotted her as soon as we walked in because she looked so much like Magdalena from all the photos I'd seen on the news. She had the same dark hair and the same shape to her face, and when she stood up to greet us, I could see her eyes were red and swollen from months of crying. She hugged both of us before we even sat down and started thanking us through tears. She kept saying that at least now her family could have closure and bring Magdalena home for a proper burial. I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand across the table while she cried. Camilla was crying too, and I felt tears running down my own face even though I was trying to hold it together. Felicia started telling us about Magdalena's life once she calmed down enough to talk. She said Magdalena taught 3rd grade at an elementary school and loved her students more than anything. She showed us pictures on her phone of Magdalena in her classroom with kids gathered around her reading a book. Felicia said Magdalena spent her weekends volunteering at animal shelters because she couldn't stand the thought of dogs and cats being alone in cages. She told us Magdalena was planning to adopt a rescue dog right before she disappeared. Learning these details about the real person whose life my fiancé stole made everything feel worse somehow. Magdalena wasn't just a missing woman from the news anymore. She was a teacher who read to kids and helped animals and had plans for the future that got ripped away from her. I sat there listening to Felicia talk and felt sick thinking about how I'd kissed the man who killed this woman. How I'd slept next to him and made dinner with him and talked about our future together while he was hiding what he did. We stayed at that coffee shop for over 2 hours while Felicia shared memories and showed us more photos. When we finally left, I felt like I was carrying the weight of Magdalena's whole life with me. Detective Wynn called me the next morning with his voice sounding flat and tired. He said the medical examiner confirmed the remains were definitely Magdalena based on dental records. Then he told me the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The prosecutor was now building a murder case on top of all the theft charges. I thanked him for letting me know and sat on my bed staring at the wall for a long time after we hung up. The words blunt force trauma kept repeating in my head, and I couldn't stop imagining what Magdalena's last moments must have been like. A week later, Detective Wynn called again to tell me that my fiancé's lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal. The lawyer wanted to argue that Magdalena's death was a tragic accident, and my fiancé panicked and hid the body instead of calling for help. I felt rage flood through me when I heard that. Detective Wynn said the prosecutor, Ezekiel Houston, refused the plea deal immediately because the evidence was strong enough for trial and Magdalena's family deserved to see full justice served. He said Houston told the defense lawyer that you don't accidentally kill someone and then steal from dozens of other women for years. The investigation kept growing bigger. An FBI agent named Conrad Ferguson joined the case because they found evidence suggesting my fiancé might have done similar crimes in other states where he lived before moving here. Ferguson called me directly to ask questions about places my fiancé mentioned visiting or living in the past. I told him everything I could remember about the stories my fiancé told me about his life before we met. Ferguson said they were looking into missing person cases in 3 other states that matched the same pattern of women he dated who disappeared after jewelry went missing. 2 weeks after Magdalena's remains were found, Ezekiel Houston called and said I needed to come give a formal deposition. I sat in his office for 4 hours, answering questions about every detail of my relationship with my fiancé. Houston asked about our first date, how we met, what he told me about his past, whether I noticed any strange behavior or unexplained absences. The whole time I was talking, I felt like I was describing a stranger instead of someone I agreed to marry. Houston recorded everything and had me sign statements confirming what I said was true. The process felt cold and clinical, but also necessary. Camilla gave her deposition the same day in a different room. When we met up afterward in the parking lot, she looked as drained as I felt. She told me Houston asked her detailed questions about the theft from 5 years ago, and about how we set the trap that led to finding the storage unit. Houston warned both of us that we'd probably need to testify at trial, and that the defense would try to make us look unreliable, or like we had ulterior motives. He said to prepare ourselves for that. The evidence kept piling up. The landlord of the storage facility came forward with rental records showing my fiancé had that unit for 8 years and paid in cash every month. Detective Wynn told me they also got security footage from 6 months ago showing my fiancé bringing large duffel bags to the unit right around the time Magdalena disappeared. Then a woman who lived near the storage facility contacted the police saying she saw my fiancé there late one night 6 months ago. She remembered it because he seemed upset and was carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp from his car into the unit. She said she almost called the police that night because something felt wrong about the whole situation, but she talked herself out of it. Now her testimony placed him at the storage unit with what could have been Magdalena's body before he moved it to that rural property where they found her. Detective Wynn called 3 days later with news that made everything feel even more real. The forensic team found soil samples in my fiancé's car trunk that matched the exact type of soil from where they found Magdalena buried. He explained that the soil had specific mineral content and plant material that only existed in that rural area, which meant my fiancé's car had definitely been at that burial site. This wasn't just circumstantial anymore. They had physical evidence linking his vehicle directly to where he put Magdalena's body. I hung up the phone and realized I couldn't keep functioning like normal while processing all of this. Camilla suggested I talk to someone professional because I was barely sleeping and having panic attacks every time I thought about how close I came to marrying a murderer. She gave me the name of a therapist who worked with trauma victims. I called that afternoon and got an appointment for the next day with Angelina Mori. Sitting in her office felt strange at first because I'd never done therapy before. Angelina had this calm way of listening that made it easier to talk about everything. I told her about the proposal, the ring, discovering the theft, finding Magdalena's license, all of it. She asked me questions about how I was sleeping and eating, whether I felt safe in my daily life. I admitted I was having nightmares where my fiancé was chasing me through dark hallways, and I couldn't stop thinking about all the times we were alone together and what he might have been capable of doing to me. Angelina explained that trauma responses were normal after discovering someone you trusted was dangerous. She helped me understand that his deception wasn't about my judgment being bad, but about how good he was at manipulation. Serial criminals spend years perfecting their ability to seem normal and trustworthy. That first session helped me realize I needed regular appointments to work through this. Meanwhile, the investigation kept expanding in ways I couldn't have imagined. Conrad Ferguson from the FBI called to tell me they'd been looking into missing person cases in states where my fiancé lived before moving here. They found 2 other women who fit the exact same pattern. Both had dated my fiancé. Both reported jewelry stolen before the relationship ended, and both disappeared within months of breaking up with him. Ferguson said they were working with local police in those states to investigate further. He asked me more questions about places my fiancé mentioned traveling to, and whether he ever talked about his past relationships. I told him everything I could remember, but it wasn't much because my fiancé always kept his past vague. A week after that conversation, Ezekiel Houston called me to his office to discuss the trial timeline. I sat across from his desk while he explained that a case this complicated would take at least 6 months to prepare properly. They had to process all the forensic evidence, interview dozens of witnesses, and build an airtight case for the murder charge. Houston said he felt confident about getting convictions on the theft charges because the evidence was overwhelming, but the murder charge required more careful preparation. The physical evidence was strong with the soil samples and fingerprints on Magdalena's phone, but they needed to establish clear motive and opportunity. He warned me that the defense would try every trick to create reasonable doubt. I asked if there was anything I could do to help, and Houston said my testimony would be crucial, along with Camilla's and all the other victims we'd identified. That gave me an idea for something productive I could do while waiting for the trial. I called Camilla and suggested we work with Detective Wynn to return all the stolen jewelry to the women we'd identified. We spent the next month setting up meetings with victim after victim, giving back their property and listening to their stories. Each meeting felt heavy with emotion. A woman named Jessica cried when we returned her grandmother's pearl necklace that had been stolen 3 years ago. She told us she'd dated my fiancé for 8 months and noticed expensive jewelry going missing, but he convinced her she was being paranoid and probably misplaced the items herself. Another woman, Rachel, got angry when she saw her diamond bracelet. She said my fiancé had gaslit her for months about the missing jewelry, making her feel crazy for suspecting him. Hearing their stories made me realize how calculated his whole operation was. He didn't just steal random items. He targeted specific pieces that had value but weren't, so expensive that women would immediately call the police. He made them doubt themselves first. One afternoon, we met with a woman named Lauren, who had a story that shook me. She told us she broke up with my fiancé 2 years ago because he became possessive and controlling near the end of their relationship. He started showing up at her workplace unannounced and getting jealous if she spent time with friends. She said she felt genuinely unsafe and worried he might hurt her, so she ended things and blocked his number. Lauren looked at me with serious eyes and said she was grateful every day that she got out when she did. Her jewelry had gone missing, but she considered that a small price to pay for escaping what she felt was a dangerous situation. Hearing her describe his behavior made me think about times when my fiancé seemed overly interested in where I was going or who I was with. I'd written it off as him being caring and attentive, but now I wondered if I'd missed warning signs. The prosecutor's office moved forward with formal charges in early fall. Ezekiel Houston called to tell me they were charging my fiancé with first-degree murder in Magdalena's death, along with multiple counts of grand theft and fraud charges related to selling stolen jewelry. The bail was set at $2 million, which meant he'd stay in custody until trial. Houston sounded satisfied when he explained that the evidence was strong enough to pursue the maximum charges. Around that same time, Felicia Rankin reached out to Camilla and me with a request. Magdalena's remains had been released to the family, and they wanted to hold a proper memorial service now that they could finally lay her to rest. Felicia invited us to attend, saying our role in bringing Magdalena home meant we were part of her story. I felt nervous about going because I didn't know if I had the right to be there, but Camilla convinced me that Felicia genuinely wanted us present. The memorial service was held at a small church on a Saturday afternoon. Walking into that space filled with people who loved Magdalena felt overwhelming. Photos of her were displayed around the room showing a smiling woman with kind eyes who looked so alive and happy. I stood in the back trying to stay invisible, but Felicia saw me and walked over. She introduced me to Magdalena's mother, a woman with the same gentle face as her daughter, but aged by months of grief. Magdalena's mother took my hands in hers and thanked me for helping bring her daughter home. She said not knowing what happened to Magdalena was torture, and even though the truth was horrible, at least now they could have closure and say goodbye properly. I started crying and told her I felt guilty for ever being with the man who killed her daughter. She squeezed my hands tighter and said I wasn't responsible for his evil. She told me I helped give their family peace by uncovering the truth, and that took courage. Standing in that church surrounded by Magdalena's family and friends, I felt the full weight of what my fiancé had destroyed. This wasn't just about stolen jewelry or even about one murder. He'd shattered entire families and left dozens of women traumatized. 2 days after the memorial, Conrad Ferguson called with news that made everything even worse. The FBI had confirmed that the 2 other missing women from different states were also murdered. They found evidence linking my fiancé to their deaths through the same patterns of theft and disposal methods. Ferguson's voice was grim when he told me my fiancé was likely a serial killer who'd been operating for nearly a decade. They were still investigating whether there might be even more victims they hadn't identified yet. I sat on Camilla's couch after that phone call feeling numb. The man who proposed to me with a stolen ring, who I'd planned to spend my life with, had been killing women for years. The news broke on every major channel within 24 hours of the FBI confirming my fiancé was connected to multiple murders across different states. My phone started ringing before I even woke up that morning. Reporters calling from newspapers and TV stations asking for interviews about my relationship with a serial killer. I turned off my phone after the 15th call because I couldn't handle hearing one more person ask me what it was like to be engaged to a murderer. Camilla's phone was blowing up too, and we sat in her apartment watching the news coverage with growing horror as they showed photos of my fiancé next to pictures of Magdalena and the other victims. The reporters called me his fiancé and showed the Instagram photos I'd posted of the engagement ring, and I felt sick knowing millions of people were seeing those happy pictures while knowing what he really was. A reporter somehow got Camilla's address and knocked on her door asking for an interview, and she told him to leave or she'd call the police. I knew I could never be the public face of this nightmare. Couldn't stand in front of cameras talking about how I almost married someone who killed multiple women. Every media request went straight to voicemail, and eventually I changed my number completely just to make it stop. Ezekiel Houston called me a few days later to discuss the legal situation, his voice serious as he explained the defense was trying to get the storage unit evidence thrown out. He said the defense lawyer argued that because Camilla and I broke into the unit illegally, everything we found couldn't be used in court. I felt panic rising in my chest because without that evidence the whole case could fall apart, but Ezekiel told me not to worry. He explained that the judge would probably allow the evidence anyway because of emergency circumstances, and because the police got a proper search warrant right after we reported what we found. The preliminary hearings turned into a battle between the prosecutor and defense attorney over what the jury would get to hear, with the defense trying to block every piece of evidence we'd discovered. Ezekiel called me after each hearing to update me on the progress, and I could hear the frustration in his voice when the defense managed to delay things with procedural arguments. The legal process moved slower than I expected, with weeks passing between hearings while lawyers argued over technical details. I had to go back to my apartment eventually to get more of my things, because I couldn't keep borrowing Camilla's clothes forever. Walking through that door made my skin crawl knowing I'd shared that space with someone who murdered people. Everything looked exactly the same as the morning he got arrested, his coffee mug still in the sink and his jacket hanging by the door. I couldn't touch anything that belonged to him without feeling disgusted, couldn't look at our bed without thinking about all the nights I slept next to a killer. I called a moving company and hired them to pack up everything I owned and put it in a storage unit because I knew I could never live in that apartment again. The movers came the next day and I stood in the hallway while they boxed up my entire life, unable to step inside and watch them handle things he'd touched. When they were done, I handed my keys to the landlord and walked away without looking back. Camilla helped me search for a new apartment on the other side of town, somewhere with no memories and no connection to my old life. We spent weekends looking at places until I found a small one-bedroom that felt safe and anonymous. Moving into that empty apartment felt like starting over from nothing, but at least the space was mine and untainted by what happened. I changed my phone number and deleted every social media account I had, erasing my online presence completely. Instagram, Facebook, everything went dark, because I couldn't handle seeing people's comments or having reporters track me down through old posts. I threw away photos of my fiancé and deleted every text message we'd ever exchanged, trying to erase him from my life even though I knew I'd never forget. Slowly, I started building a routine that felt normal, going to work and coming home to my safe apartment where nothing reminded me of him. Camilla came over most evenings and we'd have dinner together, not talking about the case unless there was news, just being two people trying to move forward. 8 months after they found Magdalena's remains, the trial finally began, and I had to go to the courthouse to face my former fiancé for the first time since his arrest. I sat in the witness waiting room with Camilla while the jury was selected, both of us too nervous to talk much. When they called me into the courtroom, I walked through those doors and saw him sitting at the defense table in a suit, looking smaller somehow without the charm and confidence he used to have. Our eyes met across the room and I felt nothing but disgust, no trace of the love I thought I felt when he proposed. He looked away first, and I took my seat in the gallery, watching as the prosecutor and defense attorney gave their opening statements. Ezekiel Houston laid out the case methodically, explaining how my fiancé had targeted women for years through dating relationships, stealing from them and eventually killing at least 3 of them. The defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that my fiancé was innocent, but his words sounded hollow against the weight of what Ezekiel presented. When they called me to testify, I walked to the witness stand with my hands shaking, swore to tell the truth, and sat down facing the courtroom. Ezekiel asked me to describe my relationship with the defendant, and I explained how we met and dated for 2 years before he proposed with the stolen ring. I testified about finding the fake jewelry in my box and realizing he'd been replacing my real pieces with costume jewelry. I described setting up the trap with Camilla and discovering the storage unit full of stolen items from dozens of women. The defense attorney stood up for cross-examination and immediately tried to paint me as a woman scorned, asking if I was angry about the breakup and making up stories for revenge. I looked right at him and said we never broke up because he got arrested before I could confront him about the theft. He asked if I'd ever seen my fiancé act violently, and I had to admit I hadn't, which seemed to satisfy him. But then Ezekiel stood up for redirect and asked me to describe the camping trip my fiancé took last spring, right around when Magdalena disappeared, and I explained how he'd gone alone for 4 days to some family property. The jury took notes while I spoke, and I could see some of them looking at my former fiancé with disgust. Camilla testified after me, describing how her grandmother's ring disappeared 5 years ago after she broke up with the defendant. She explained the police report she filed and how she recognized the ring in my Instagram photos. She walked the jury through our plan to catch him stealing and how we found the storage unit full of jewelry. The defense attorney tried to discredit her by pointing out she'd broken into the storage unit illegally, but Camilla stayed calm and said she was trying to recover her grandmother's stolen property. Detective Wynn took the stand next and testified about the investigation into his sister Magdalena's disappearance. His voice stayed professional, but I could see the pain in his eyes as he described finding her remains on the defendant's family property. He explained the evidence linking my fiancé to the murder, including fingerprints on Magdalena's phone and soil samples from the defendant's car matching the burial site. The forensic evidence came next, and it was overwhelming in its thoroughness and detail. Natalia Peacock testified about finding my fiancé's fingerprints on Magdalena's phone case, prints that couldn't be explained away since he claimed never to have met her. The soil expert explained how samples from the defendant's car trunk matched the specific composition of dirt from the burial site, including rare minerals found only in that area. Security footage from the storage facility showed the defendant bringing large duffel bags to his unit around the time Magdalena disappeared, bags that matched the ones we found filled with stolen jewelry. Multiple women testified about jewelry disappearing after dating the defendant, establishing a clear pattern of theft through romantic relationships spanning almost a decade. The defense attorney tried to create doubt by questioning the timeline and suggesting other explanations, but every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. His forensic expert couldn't explain away the fingerprints or soil samples, and his character witnesses couldn't overcome the testimony from dozens of victims describing identical experiences. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury for deliberation. I sat in the courthouse cafeteria with Camilla and Felicia Rankin waiting for word, unable to eat or focus on anything except what was happening upstairs. 6 hours later, we got called back to the courtroom because the jury had reached a verdict. I took my seat and watched the jury file in, trying to read their faces for some hint of what they'd decided. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreman stood up holding a piece of paper. He read guilty on first-degree murder for Magdalena's death, guilty on all theft charges, guilty on fraud charges for selling stolen jewelry. My fiancé sat completely still as each guilty verdict was read, showing no emotion at all, like he was listening to someone else's trial. But when I looked over at Felicia, she'd collapsed forward in her seat, crying with relief that her sister's killer would be held accountable. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later and dismissed the jury, and I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I could finally breathe. The sentencing hearing was shorter and more formal than the trial. The judge asked if anyone wanted to make a statement before he imposed sentence, and Felicia stood up to speak about her sister. She described Magdalena as a kind person who loved teaching and helping others, and said her family had suffered for months not knowing what happened. She looked directly at my former fiancé and told him he'd stolen not just her sister's life, but her family's peace and sense of safety in the world. I watched him as she spoke, and his face remained blank, no sign of remorse or emotion. The judge then imposed sentence: life in prison without possibility of parole for Magdalena's murder, plus additional sentences for each theft and fraud conviction to run one after another. He said the defendant had shown a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable women and deserved the maximum punishment under law. As the bailiffs led my former fiancé out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he turned and looked at me one final time. I stared back at him, searching for some trace of the person I thought I knew, but all I saw in his eyes was emptiness, like there was nothing human left inside him at all. 2 days after the sentencing, Felicia, Camilla, and I met at a small coffee shop on the edge of town, where nobody would recognize us or interrupt. We sat at a corner table by the window, and for the first few minutes none of us knew what to say, because the trial was over, but the weight of everything that happened still pressed down on all of us. Felicia ordered tea and wrapped her hands around the cup like she was trying to warm herself even though it was summer outside. Camilla suggested we should do something with what we learned, something that might help other women avoid what happened to Magdalena and all the other victims. I pulled out my phone and started taking notes as we talked through ideas for a foundation that could teach women the warning signs of predatory behavior in relationships and provide resources for reporting theft. Felicia said her family wanted to contribute money to get it started, and Camilla offered to handle the legal paperwork since she had connections through her job. We spent 3 hours in that coffee shop mapping out plans and filling napkins with notes about awareness campaigns and support networks. When we finally left, I felt like we were taking something horrible and turning it into something that might actually protect people. A year after that awful discovery in the storage unit, I'm living in a different apartment across town and slowly building a life that feels safe again. Camilla comes over every Sunday for coffee, and we've become real friends instead of just two women connected by trauma. I still see Angelina every week for therapy, and she says I'm making good progress, even though I probably need to keep coming for a long time. The nightmares about my ex-fiancé don't happen every night anymore, maybe twice a week now instead of constantly. I changed my phone number and deleted all my social media accounts and started fresh with new everything. The foundation Felicia, Camilla, and I created launched 6 months ago, and we've already helped dozens of women recognize dangerous patterns in their relationships. I still can't believe how close I came to marrying someone capable of murder, how I lived with him and loved him without seeing what he really was. But I'm grateful every single day that Camilla sent that Instagram message about her grandmother's ring, because without her reaching out, I might have married him and ended up like Magdalena. I'm learning to trust my judgment again and feel safe in my own apartment, and believe that not everyone is hiding something terrible. The work continues, and the healing continues, and I know I'll never completely forget what happened. But I'm moving forward instead of staying stuck in that moment when we found Magdalena's license in the storage unit.